The purpose of this brief mini presentation is to look at the concept of preaching and teaching in the New Testament and then compare it to the way we use the terms preaching and teaching in the contemporary church. And so the core issue here really is whether or not preaching and teaching are the same thing. So many in contemporary society assume that good preaching is in fact teaching. Still others assume that preaching is teaching that includes some kind of application or it drives towards an application. Still others assume that preaching involves more of an emotional or a volitional appeal and that that's what we're driving towards. We're trying to convince people of something. It's more of like a persuasive speech. And yet others assume a distinction between missionary preaching or kind of like evangelistic preaching and then teaching preaching, what would normally occur on Sundays from a pulpit, let's say. The problem, or the contemporary problem, is that we tend to use preach in a variety of ways um, to reference a variety of methods and a different set of content that we're trying to deliver. The other problem is that we tend to use teaching in an equally diverse set of ways to reference different methodologies or even different types of content that we're hoping to deliver to people. So we're using both words in a kind of diverse um, set of ways, and that convolutes the distinction that we might want to make between preaching and teaching. Most of the material that I'm taking here is from a helpful article by Rowe, and what he does is he goes into the New Testament to look at how the New Testament writers used the word preach and teach. And so that's what I want to do is walk through this here, and then we'll try to see what are the similarities and differences between the way we use the words preach and teach versus the way they're used in the New Testament. So what he discovers is, first of all, that New Testament preaching is generally a translation of two words, either kerusein or euangelizethai. And kerusein, that preaching, was normally formal proclamations of a herald in the Greco-Roman world. So it was generally some kind of authoritative summons to obedience on behalf of an emperor. So this herald or this person who represents the emperor would come out and would make this grand announcement on behalf of the emperor. And of course, the subjects were expected to follow that. Interestingly, that's not the only way that this word is used in the New Testament. And so we need to keep that in mind. In Mark 5:20, this word for announce is also used of a man telling others about how he was healed by Jesus. It's also important to note that the use of teaching, this word didaskein, and preaching, the word kerusein, in a number of texts, such as Matthew 4:23, Matthew 9:35, etc., indicate that they're actually separate activities. So when we have these grand summary statements about Jesus' ministry, it says that he went about the towns and villages teaching and preaching. And so the fact that they're put together in these sequences indicates that they're not actually the same activity, that they are different types of activities. And we see that with the use of these two words. The second word that's used of preaching is this word that comes from euangelion or euangelizethai. And this generally meant, again, to announce, but it's to announce joyful news of victory and peace. Or it's also used to announce the wedding or birth of a son. And so they seem to, both kerusein and euangelizethai, seem to refer to similar activities, but they're emphasizing different qualities. So where kerusein emphasizes authority, here with this word, we're emphasizing the concept of joy. Remember, euangelion is good news. It's joyful news. And so what we're announcing here is something joyful. And again, it's important to note that the use of teaching, or didaskein, and preaching, this time euangelizethai, in certain texts, like Luke 21 and Acts 5:42 indicate that they're different activities. Again, both of them are used together, teaching and preaching. So it seems like they must refer to different activities, at least in the New Testament. So what I'd like to do now is turn my attention away from the word preaching to the New Testament word for teaching. And generally, this is a translation of the word didaskein. There are a couple other words that are used out there. There's actually a word that really should be translated dialogue that is sometimes translated preaching, sometimes teaching, and we need to be careful of those. Again, whenever you're reading these words in your English translation, remember that there may be a different nuance in the Greek word. So in this case, teaching is didaskein, and didaskein is a term used of both formal and informal instruction throughout the New Testament. So Jesus actually taught his disciples on the mountain. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. It's really best translated the teaching on the mountain. And he also taught using a variety of means, including parables and such. Interestingly, in the Great Commandment in Matthew 28, or the Great Commission rather, the disciples are commanded to make disciples by teaching, right? So we don't actually see the word preaching emerge here, but we do see teaching. The early church leaders in Timothy and Titus were instructed to stand guard against false teaching. They're to guard the teaching of the church and the purity of the instruction that was passed on to them. And they're to engage in passing along that teaching from one generation to the next, as we see in 2 Timothy. So the purpose here is to just examine these words and to recognize that what we mean by preaching and teaching today is likely quite different from the New Testament usage. So for the most part, the New Testament is primarily concerned with teaching. In the New Testament, teaching is not an assumed element of preaching, as some would claim today. In fact, preaching is primarily a kind of proclamational activity, which when it's used of Jesus going about preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And it's this announcement of good news. It's an announcement of this inbreaking of God. It's an announcement of the King and what he has done for us. And teaching has a very central role, but slightly different. Interestingly, in many ways, I would suggest, and I think Rowe is trying to suggest in his article, that contemporary preaching is more or less another form of teaching. And that was not necessarily its primary function in the New Testament. So the purpose of this presentation really is to help us discriminate the way we use the word teach and preach from the way they're used in the New Testament, and to recognize that we need to be careful of assuming that our concept of preaching in contemporary American society anyway, may not be exactly what it was in the New Testament. And to also admit, basically, that what we're doing many times through our preaching activity in the church is more or less another form of teaching, another kind of teaching. That's not to say that that's wrong, it's inappropriate or anything like that. It's fine. We need to embrace it, though, as for what it is, as another way, another form of teaching. Thank you so much.